I'm delighted to hand over to Dr. Ken Sutherland, Dr. Ken Sutherland from Canon Medical Research Europe, who will be introducing our panel. So thanks so much, Ken. Over to you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us here in Glasgow and joining us online as well. Can I add my welcome to the organisers for you joining this event here today and yesterday. I hope you're having a good time so far, and we'll try not to let things drop away during this panel session. And just a reminder to please add your questions. The whole point of this is a chance for us to engage with those of you here and also online to get a proper conversation going. So please take the opportunity to ask your questions, because they'll appear in front of me and I can just about read it if I hold it about here, so that should be okay. So my name's Ken Sutherland. I'm working for Canon Medical, and the reason why we came up with this title for this panel session here, AI for Precision Medicine, was that we felt having one overhyped term, AI, wasn't enough. So we needed to add another overhyped term in precision medicine to give us a proper session title for the panel discussion. So precision medicine, in my mind, so I'm not a doctor, I'm an engineer by trade. Precision medicine, in my mind, is all about bringing data to bear when you make a clinical choice for an individual patient. What you want to be able to do, what we all want to be able to do as patients, is we want ourselves or our clinical care team to be able to look at all of the relevant data about us and decide for us as individuals what's the optimal treatment plan for me or for you or any one of us. You know, a dozen of us in this room could have the same disorder, but the treatment that works for me might not work for any of the rest of the people within this audience for a number of different reasons. Genetics is an obvious one, but also lifestyle, environmental risk profile, and a bunch of other things as well. So what precision medicine is all about is taking all of that data and bringing it to bear at the point at which a clinician makes a decision. Now, why is AI relevant here? Because pretty obviously, you're going to be overwhelmed if you get all that data, and if you try and present that to a human viewer. Essentially, you're going to completely overload that human viewer, and they're not going to be able to make an effective decision. They're just going to be lost in the swamp of data. So our intention, really, as a company, as Canon Medical, and we'll get other people's views on this as we go around the panel, but our view is that AI is going to form an important part of separating the wheat from the chaff and working out what's really relevant and what's necessary information to help a clinical care team make that optimal choice for an individual patient. So that's what we're going to try and explore over the next 3.5 days. I'm glad you've joined us for all that time, because it's certainly going to take us that long to do anything to do it justice. But no, shall try our very best to just scratch the surface of this topic during this brief panel session. And what we've tried to do is build a panel that represents what I'm very familiar with, a number of people very familiar with as well, I'm sure, this idea of triple helix model of innovation. So bringing together public sector government with academia, with industry together to try and innovate and to solve problems, and certainly in a sort of pre-competitive environment. So actually our panel kind of represents that theme. And I'd now like to hand over to Phil to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on why this topic is relevant and what you've been up to recently.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in Glasgow. So I'm Phil Waywell, I'm Director of Digital Partnerships, and I'm based in Yorkshire and the Humber, across that part of England. And my role is that I work at an organisation called an Academic Health Science Network, or an AHSN, because we all have enough acronyms in our lives, don't we? So if you're not familiar with AHSNs, the best way to think about it is that we are the kind of innovation arm of the healthcare system in England. There are 15 that are funded across England. And we're the interface between innovators of various different types and the healthcare system. And we have two main parts to our remit. Supporting the adoption and spread of innovation to improve patient outcomes and kind of efficiency of the healthcare system in general. That's the first kind of main pillar of what we do. And the second focus for us is around economic growth. So a lot of the work that we do is around bringing innovators into our region, helping them grow their businesses, and through that growth, creating new jobs. And you get a kind of virtuous circle there. So one of the strongest positive indicators of healthy outcomes is having a well-paid job. So the two go hand in hand, and as an organisation, that's what we focus on across our region. So far you're probably thinking, so why is he sat in a panel about AI and precision medicine? So, as Director of Digital Partnerships, I'm particularly interested in how the healthcare system uses its data and data infrastructure. So my background is I've done about 10 years working in universities, and particularly in kind of data-driven research. And at the moment, I'm working on and leading the development of a business case for something called a secure data environment for research and development. And that's an NHS England funded programme. And one of the main use cases of that infrastructure will be to support the development, validation, and hopefully the adoption of new AI products and AI-based services. So that's why this particular conversation is particularly relevant to me, because I want to better understand, how do we make a secure data environment, which is infrastructure, secure infrastructure, and services for researchers to use that infrastructure. How do we make that relevant to this community so that it can do what it's designed for, supporting that development of AI in the future? So looking forward to today's conversation.
Great.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Phil. And Sandosh?
Hello, good morning. I'm Sandosh Padmanabhan. I'm a professor of cardiovascular genomics at the University of Glasgow. And I have 3 roles. I'm a clinician, so I work in the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, primarily focusing on hypertension. And in the university, my research has been on genomics of hypertension, clinical trials, and predictive analysis of large data. More recently, I have got responsibilities in the Living Lab. The Living Lab in Glasgow is a UKRI-funded Strength in Places project. And the premise of the Living Lab is to address one of the biggest challenges in precision medicine, and that is adoption, bringing precision medicine adoption into healthcare systems quickly. And that's the biggest barrier. And the Living Lab is hoping to achieve that through what Ken mentioned, the triple helix of partnership between academia, NHS, and industry. So within the Living Lab, I am the academic lead of 2 projects. One is the pharmacogenetics work package that's envisaging to implement pharmacogenetics across Scotland within the NHS. And the second one relevant to this topic here is the Digital Health Validation Lab, which plans to provide a platform where early innovators, big industry, and SMEs can have access to a range of clinical expertise, do early clinical evaluation of their product, and be able to refine and make it fit for purpose. So the aim is, if you do evaluation early in the development cycle, you actually bring a product that's ready for adoption. So we are 1.5 years into the Digital Health Validation Lab, and the Digital Health Validation Lab is in partnership with Canon, and we are looking to attract more industry into coming and working with us. So in relation to precision medicine, it's that the last mile solution. That's what the Living Lab is trying to do. How do you get all these innovations quickly into clinical practice? Because that's where patients will benefit from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandosh. And Leslie?
So Leslie Anderson, I am a professor of health data science at the University of Aberdeen. And my main area of research up to the point of moving to Aberdeen in 2020 was in cancer research. And I've been working in the cancer research field primarily in looking at predictive markers for patients with pre-cancerous conditions and identifying how we can identify those individuals that are most likely to progress to cancer, to detect it early and to be able to offer effective treatment. Since joining the University of Aberdeen, I came on board as academic lead for the Industrial Centre for Artificial Intelligence Research and Digital Diagnostics, or ICARD, which I'm sure you've heard of previously from some of the other conversations this week. But ICARD really was looking to integrate AI and to bring data together to be able to identify how can we utilise the information that's available within the healthcare system. And much of the data that I've had access to over the last 20 years has been in sort of a quantitative mechanism of analysis, so just data that's there in tables. But what we've been able to do through the iCare platform and through Canon's involvement with development of the Safe Haven artificial intelligence platform has been able to really drill down into the detail of information that's available. So being able to utilise imaging data across radiology and pathology within iCare, and also being able to drill down into the detail of clinical letters, for example, or radiology reports, clinical reports, where a lot of really important information resides. And I suppose from my perspective, it's how do we utilise that data that we have? And as Ken said, you know, a clinician doesn't have time to go through 20, 40, 80 years of history of a patient and understanding how they may respond to a treatment. And looking at how do we provision that data in a way that's accessible to healthcare to really be able to treat effectively and to improve health outcomes.
Great, thanks Leslie. And I'm sure you'll agree we've got a great panel. Unfortunately, we are short if our final panelist wasn't able to make it because her mother's unwell, but let's not let that harm our conversation this morning here. Please, a reminder to post your questions and to give us input to make sure that we can steer this conversation that's going to benefit all of us here. So just a reminder on that. I guess I have a personal perspective on this topic. My parents were both doctors, NHS doctors. My dad was a GP practicing 30 years ago or whatever, and essentially had a stethoscope and a lot of experience. And part of his experience was in a model that no longer exists in primary care, certainly in this country, which is at the time he was called the family doctor. And he understood people, he understood their background, he knew the family, it was a rural area, small population. And so he was able to bring, essentially what he was doing was bringing all of that data to bear himself when he made that decision about an individual with a particular disorder or whatever. He knew their socioeconomic situation, he knew their family history, he knew where their parents were, you know, died of or were still alive of or suffering from. And some of them he brought them into the world himself, he delivered them into the world himself. So I think that's a model that I understand, and wouldn't it be great if we can get somewhere similar with technology and allow technology to provide and fill that gap of continuity as well across the whole care system? Because I think it's one of the challenges when a clinician makes a clinical choice is they can't access all of that longitudinal record because it's broken up and in different places. So one more question for me before we dive into your questions. So again, a reminder, please keep posting questions. I want to start with Leslie on this one. Why now? Why is now a good time for us to be looking at using AI for precision medicine?
So I think there's been huge advances both in the development of AI but also in the accessibility of healthcare information. As I said, I've been working for 20 years in the sector with data from the United States, from Sweden, from Denmark, from Vietnam, from Africa. But what we now have, and particularly in Scotland with the trusted research environments, is access to healthcare data. What we're now looking at doing, so it's been primarily data coming in from secondary care, but what we're now looking at being able to do is bring in primary care data, which is really critical in making decisions, and there's a wealth of information within that. But also bringing in and linking administrative data, so understanding the financial situation, for example, of individuals or the impacts that might have. So I think now we are in a position where we have access to information. I'm hoping that access becomes better and that the timeline in gaining access to data is reduced so that we can really get to answering questions quickly. But also that we now have the development of artificial intelligence techniques. There's lots of companies that are involved, and really having that triple helix approach of working with industry, NHS and academia has been critically important in the progress that we've been making within the iCare collaboration. So.
Great, thanks Leslie. I'm going to come back on a couple of these points, but I'm going to let the other guys in first before I dive in. Sandosh,
Yep.
Why now?
Yep, thanks. So I will answer the question slightly differently. So if I look at precision medicine, yes, data is important, and data is the sort of backbone for precision medicine. But precision medicine is the entire pipeline, right from innovation through to adoption of an innovation. So you need to have development and maturity at every point in that pipeline. As Ken mentioned, you need to have everything so that the physician and the patient benefits. So in that context, if you look at why now, it's a range of examples. We have good examples from cancer where they use big data from genomics, The underlying process is to look at genomic data and then extract information and link that to treatment. So that's a successful example. If you look at imaging, that's early diagnosis. You want to look at imaging data so that the physicians can diagnose cancer very early and then initiate treatment. So now you have AI helping, sitting in the background, looking at good quality data and producing actionable insights for the physician. Then what you want to do is to bring all that or scale the successes in these domains to the larger primary care and all the common diseases. And therein comes the problem of multimodal data and pretty noisy and messy data. And when you look at AI and machine learning, you need to have good quality data and the right context. So machine learning and AI technology is improving, so that's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is data, and you need a close collaboration between the users, which would be the clinicians, the data generators, and the technologists and the industry partners, so that they understand the provenance of the data, and this feedback between both of them will ensure that you can accelerate more accurate, reliable, and trusted AI solutions. So we have very good examples, and the other biggest driver is the development of wearables and devices. Now everybody's got a mobile phone and wearables. So individual level data is going to be generated at scale very soon, and we need to be prepared for using that. Right now there are no solutions to integrate all that and produce actionable insights. You need the data, and the model needs to be trusted. If it has to be implemented by clinicians, you need to have patients trust a black box algorithm. So there is a lot of work to be done. The backbone of that is data and technology. We have the tailwind from the huge successes from imaging and cancer, and now we want to scale up to wider clinical medicine.
Great, thanks so much.
I'm not allowed to say I agree with all of the above and then go quite much, although I do agree with everything that Leslie and Sandosh have just said. So if I think about this question from the point of view of the kind of healthcare stakeholders that I work with, why now? So, over the last few years, and we're on a journey, Leslie and Sandosh are completely right in that there's a huge amount of investment gone in across the UK around data access. So lots of different types of investment in terms of getting, as Leslie said, secondary care data and increasingly linked to primary care, and then you go into administrative data, and you open up a whole new kind of vista when you go into real, genuine multimodal data when we bring in imaging. Okay, so lots of investment over the last few years, and it's important to say, and it was a kind of an oversight on my part when I introduced myself. In many respects, the work in Scotland is really leading the way, and I've encouraged colleagues in NHS England. I get a speaker fee for this, don't I? But genuinely, the programme that I mentioned earlier, so the secure data environments, formerly known as trusted research environments, formerly known as data safe havens, So it's NHS England funding, as I've mentioned, but I've really strongly encouraged that team to come and speak to colleagues up here in this part of the world to learn from the experience of how do you make these things happen. So, first part of the question is, we've invested a lot in data access. However, the healthcare stakeholders that I work with, they don't want the data. They're not interested in the data. They want the insight that you can generate from those data. And now, if you kind of flip back to the first part of my question, we're getting increasingly complicated combinations of data. How do you bridge the gap from data to insight? To me, that is where AI sits really importantly. So why now? Because we've made all this investment, and without the development of AI techniques and methods, we're not going to be able to unleash the potential of the data that we're pulling together. So now is exactly the right time for us to be having this conversation.
Good, brilliant, because you're going to get challenged on some of that, Phil, from some of the questions that have come in. There's loads of good questions, so we're going to dive into these because they actually answer some really good questions. A question in here, it's a really interesting one actually, pick out here. It's just moved. Is good quality integrated data available to clinicians actually more of an immediate priority than AI? In other words, operational, not just data in research environments. So just the level of digital maturity, I guess, within today's operational NHS. Isn't that as big a challenge? Can we build on top of that foundation if that foundation isn't there? How's that going to work? Who wants to have a go at that? Sandosh, great, good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question and very relevant, because if you look at Scotland, our secondary care NHS IT systems do not talk to primary care IT systems. And currently there are 2 different primary care IT systems which don't talk to each other. They've now got a single one. But, and that is a problem. Ken mentioned about his dad practicing medicine, and that is the art of medicine. And most of the time, what we do is the art of medicine. What we practice currently is empirical medicine, wherein it's trial and error. We have to get a lot of information from the patient, how they walk in, how they look at us. We've not reached the stage of the science of medicine completely. If you want to algorithmize everything, then we're talking about science. That means we have all the data, we've got all the algorithms, we don't need a doctor. We're still in the art of medicine stage, and that means there's increasing workload on doctors. They need good quality information quickly. You got about 10 minutes or 5 minutes to see a patient. You need to have all the right information, not trawl through. I remember long ago when I was a registrar, we used to have big case notes and we had to go through. And it was very, very valuable if we had the time to go through the notes, because we could treat the patient properly. We got AI, data is digital. Data is digitized within the NHS. It's just getting the right insights to the physician that's problematic. The second bit, and most important bit, is incomplete data or missing data. That's a huge problem within the NHS, and it's not about, the problem is people are busy. You can't have clinicians, nurses to fill in all the forms. I think for an AI system or anything, if you have missing data, that may actually cause problems. So we need to change the culture, change the system, find ways by which we can collect data without adding more burden to the frontline clinicians. So technology is there, and as Phil mentioned, technology is not a problem. Digitizing data is not a problem. It's just getting everybody to work together on a single framework so that the same data is collected on all the patients, and that's provided to the physicians.
Phil, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. So, yeah, just to pick up on some of those points. So, as I mentioned, the organisation that I'm based in, we position ourselves between the healthcare system and innovators. And what we're trying to do is make sure that good quality innovation is adopted and then spread, because patients benefit as a result of that. Now, one of the things that we often try to stress when we're talking to innovators, particularly those who are less experienced, is context is so important. You have to understand the clinical context in which your innovation will be used. So working with clinicians such as Sandosh and others is so critical. And triple helix has been mentioned a few times, and I'm a big fan of innovation theory as well. And I see it every day. It works in practice. When those collaborations are built over time, there's no quick win. Okay, you have to invest time and effort into this, but when they work, you unleash the technology and the passion and determination of clinicians in a way that patients benefit. But it's a long journey. But I would say this: we're here to help. So if you're an innovator looking to engage with the health and care system, we're happy to help advise. But you're going to need to collaborate and understand the context in which your innovation is going to be used. Number one.
Great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, and I think just even from a patient perspective, that's really critical as well, because we see innovators coming in with really good ideas, but maybe not having looked at how that could be utilised within the home environment or with the type of patients that it would be targeting. And I think so that's absolutely critical, and it is bringing all of these people together. But we've had 3 years of working within the iCare consortium within a triple helix. I would also almost say it's a quadruple helix, because we're bringing the public and patients. It's coming from different perspectives. But whenever we're doing that, it's been a real challenge because everybody's coming in with their own objectives, and trying to get a common language to work together has been a challenge, and it definitely takes time. But I think what you can benefit from doing that process is immense. And we've seen massive movements in the work that we have been doing into prospective trials of actually bringing AI into the clinical setting. And that's one of the things that we're not seeing as routinely. But I think the data that Santosh was saying, data quality is critical. I've worked with data in the US and even and in the UK too, but it being able to identify and see that we have females with prostate cancer, and you're going, well, obviously there's an error somewhere in the data coding there. But whenever you start to bring multiple data sources together, we're seeing this in some of the work that we're doing at the minute, you're bringing multiple data sources together, you have different answers in the different sets of data, which is correct. So some form of ensuring quality data is critical, because if you're developing an algorithm on data that's not of a high quality, it's not going to work effectively.
Great. Good. Thanks, Leslie. There's a really interesting question here I'm going to pick up on, because actually it includes another overhyped term that I failed to put in the title of our session, digital twins. And I'm actually going to steer this initially at Leslie to get your opinion on it. Is it realistic? When are we going to get there? Are we all going to have an individual digital twin that encompasses all of that precision medicine relevant information, and you can poke it and prod it and say, now I'm going to treat you in this way, and see what happens? Is that realistic?
I don't know whether it's realistic or not. I think at the minute we're not anywhere near that level of being able to do that. But I think that it is something that we should be striving towards, having the capability of being able to pull that information together, looking at different treatment regimes and thinking what works for the patient from a clinical perspective, and then having communication with the patient to see if that works for the patient themselves and what their choices are with regards to treatment. So I have 6 autoimmune conditions. I'm quite a complex clinical case, and all of my consultants don't speak to each other. So one consultant will tell me, oh, well, you need to do this, and I go, hold on a second, if I do that, it interacts with this treatment, and I can't do that, so can you come up with another option? So I think a lot of the time that information and that crosstalk isn't there in a clinical setting, and I think as we have an ageing population, we're going to get more and more multi-morbidity. So I think if we have the opportunity, and it's not necessarily, I don't think that every individual needs treated in with an individual treatment, but whereby we can identify, here's a range of treatments, and for your genetic, clinical, lifestyle sector, this is the best treatment from a clinical perspective that we think will work with you. So yeah, it'd be great if we had a digital twin that we could
optimistic but controlled optimism is what I'm getting there, Leslie.
It takes a long time. I've been 20 years working in this sector, and we've seen some progress, but not the huge strides of getting to that point.
Jude, any comment on that one, Phil?
Yeah, so digital twins, I know, another phrase we probably all hear a lot. For me, again, you got a very compliant panel today. We're all agreeing with each other, aren't we? I do agree with Leslie. I think an important first step, or one that we're trying to kind of complete, is to get into that kind of single patient record. I think thinking too far ahead beyond that is, carries a lot of risk, because you can create a level of expectation that the technology is able to do, X, Y, and Z, and we'll be able to kind of, manipulate those data, your digital twin, and for whatever reasons we may deem appropriate. But I think the reality is we're tracking too far ahead in terms of where the actual kind of data is in terms of connectivity. So yeah, as an aspiration, we're probably all kind of technophiles in this room, aren't we? It's one of those things where you gravitate towards it, but the kind of realist in me says we've got some way to go. So if it's a bit of a rallying call and it brings people together, then fine. But let's just be careful that we don't over-promise and under-deliver on this particular
That's
one.
great. Thanks, Phil. Great. Good. I'm going to move on, because there's loads of more questions here, and there's a really nice one here that again, I'm going to get Santosh to come in on first on this one. It's essentially around about the biases within the databases that people are using to train, and this is widely understood, I think, now that in fact a lot of medical research is based on very skewed European male populations, blokes like me, and isn't that going to hold us back? I mean, don't we need a much broader set, particularly if we're thinking about these big genetic databases like the UK Biobank and stuff like that people are putting together? What's your thoughts on that one, Sandosh?
So, I mean, yes, there are lots of biases in data. I'll again go back to the idea of precision medicine. The idea of precision medicine, it's not new. It's personalized medicine. But everybody wants personalized medicine. And that's, for the last 100 years, we've been practicing that. But it's about, over the last 15 years, the purpose of precision medicine is actually to accelerate adoption and accelerate this development of personalized medicine. And it's as a result of that, people started collecting huge amounts of data, started applying machine learning to them, and then in some cases actually started deploying them without testing. What AI and machine learning do, they are powerful methods. What they're doing is they're amplifying the biases already present in existing data. And what we are seeing now are examples of gender bias, where women are not being screened for cardiovascular diseases. Women don't get screened. People of childbearing age are not part of clinical trials. Children are not part of studies. So that there is gender bias, there is age bias in data, there is racial bias, there is socioeconomic bias. So huge amounts of bias, and these are integral to the system and the way the data is collected. So if you're going to train AI systems on the data, we will amplify those biases and perpetuate those biases. What we know now is we've seen it. We know where the problems are. We need to ensure that these biases are addressed when you take it to implementation. Sorry, there's other one. You train AI models on urban patients, which is where all your hospitals and big companies sit. Not applicable to rural patients. So there are biases all over the place. We have got this. We know that this is there. There's a lot of publicity about it. We need to address that in models now. But at the same time, we need to make sure that when we create structures like what Phil is doing, to collect more data, to integrate more data, we need to make sure that that's representative of the population.
Great. Thanks, Sandosh.
Ken, can I just come in on that? Because I think, one of the key things thinking about that is around the development of artificial intelligence models that are being looked at for detection of using chest x-ray, for example, for multiple conditions, utilize imaging data banks that are available routinely or easily accessible. And those are often the same data banks that multiple individuals are using for development purposes. And as Sandosh was saying, a lot of times the AI models are being brought in without having evaluation and testing as to whether they work in that particular population. And we've seen some really strong evidence that you can't lift AI models from one population necessarily and move to another. We saw big changes in the breast screening work, which I can go into later. But I think what we really want to be able to do here is to develop the AI models on a really comprehensive population, having sufficient numbers of people across socioeconomic circumstances, across racial groups, across age groups, to be able to really understand in the development of the algorithms what works. And it might be that different algorithms are needed for different groups in the population. So you might need to adapt your algorithm for a particular age cohort of individuals because it works more optimally in a certain way. So I think we're still at a beginning stage in that, because the way things are being developed at the minute are not utilizing large enough data banks to really be able to drill down into the bias.
Great, thanks, Leslie. I'm going to move on actually, because there's a really interesting question here. I'm going to ask Phil to come in on this one. It's really a question about how the NHS is doing the data. How is it making available the data that it does make available for AI research? Is this done on request of researchers or industry partners, or is it a specific area of interest that are driven by the NHS? Who's deciding what gets pushed into these secure data environments or TREs?
Yeah, so it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. So traditionally, the data access model was kind of based on, you make your request to a data controller, data provider. Those data would be prepared for your purpose once it had been approved, and then the data would be sent to you for you to analyse kind of locally. That's been completely inverted over the last few years. So things like the Goldacre report last year really stressed the importance of keeping the data within the health and care system and bringing the research to it. So I think it's important to call out that we're going through a transition towards that new way of remote access to data held within secure environments. In terms of what data is made available and who decides that, I think it's fair to say that in many cases the kind of priorities of kind of local research community have driven that often. So they will have invested a lot of time and effort preparing data sets that were relevant to their research. So as, for instance, we're developing our secure data environment across Yorkshire and the Humber, the natural starting point for us has been the research programs that have already been underway for several years. But that's just a subset of all of the potential research use cases, and it's important that we recognise that. So yeah, unfortunately, it's a bit of a patchwork at the moment, and what's available where reflects kind of local history and investment over time. What we're trying to do is move towards a situation where it's more consistent across the country. So that as a researcher, as an innovator, and you want to know what data sets are available for your particular purpose, you can go and you can search, because importantly, these would be made discoverable on the metadata. You can go and search nationally what's available and figure out, what's the right combination for me as an innovator. But again, we're on a journey, and it's certainly not, consistently adopted at the moment. It's been a real kind of patchwork. And it's something that I navigate through every day. It's getting better, but it's certainly not simple, and we recognise that, and we know it frustrates researchers.
That's a really good question. That's really, really good question. Really good question. Anybody else, any thoughts on that one, or shall we move on? Okay. I've got lots more. Honestly, there's loads of questions here, and I'm getting to choose, which is absolutely great. There's another really interesting one. Again, I'm going to get Phil to start on this, but actually it's relevant to all of us here, really. So health tech startups often look to the US because getting into the NHS is so difficult. How do we change that perception, or how do we change the reality to make it more plausible, more realistic?
Yeah, there are two different parts to that question, I guess. And I think one of the things that we need to get much better at is celebrating success. Actually, there's loads of great work that happens right across the UK, but we're not particularly good at communicating that to innovators, to investors, and I'd argue, possibly more importantly than anyone right now, policymakers who are making the decision about how very constrained budgets are going to be allocated moving forward. I would say that as someone who's trying to get money out of NHS England, of course I would. But I think we see kind of on the ground, so to speak, every day, fantastic innovation being adopted within the healthcare system in my part of the country, and it's true across the UK, I know it is. How we elevate that up and create a narrative that says, actually, this is a great place to develop your AI business and grow it. And no, you don't have to get to a certain stage and automatically think about, how do we exit the UK and get into another market. So yeah, I think communication is a really important part in celebrating those successes as widely as possible. So if anyone's got any great ideas about how we can do that, please, again, do give us a shout, because it's something that we're constantly wrestling with.
Thanks, Phil. Sandosh, have you got a perspective on this?
Yeah, just one comment. So in Scotland, there is recognition that there are delays and barriers to EC adoption into the NHS. But recently, the chief scientist and the Scottish government has announced they set up this pathway called the ANIA pathway. So this is an accelerated pathway to get innovations into clinical implementation. So they have literally created a new system wherein you could fast track innovations into adoption by fulfilling a predefined set of criteria. So if you could look up ANIA pathway, that would be that's Scotland's answer to this question.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's really important. There's no point in doing these developments if they're not actually going to be able to be utilised within the healthcare sector. So as part of iCared, one of the areas that we have been working on at the University of Aberdeen and an NHS Grampian has been looking at breast screening and working with a company called Curon Medical Technologies, who have developed an artificial intelligence algorithm to support the screening process. We did that in a retrospective evaluation, and it was a 13% recall rate. The standard recall rate of humans is somewhere between 5 and 12%, depending on how experienced the reader is. Whenever, however, there was a software upgrade on the machines, it went up to almost 40% recall rates. So it demonstrated that whenever you brought the machines in, it just didn't work whenever there were upgrades. But what we've been able to do and show through that process is how do we adapt and how do we change that so that it could actually be integrated into the clinical system. And we've just started a prospective study. Hopefully you'll see that in the video over the next few weeks. But we've just started a prospective study in NHS Grampian looking at the use of this algorithm within the clinical screening system. We've done it in a way in which we're not changing clinical practice for the prospective evaluation, but enabling us to look at different integration models and how that would be utilised. But I think it's that point of actually testing, evaluating to make sure that it works, and then the adoption into the clinical pathway. And that's where ANYA comes in and that process comes in. I think they're probably they don't have sufficient finances to be able to do that process for all potential solutions. And there are thousands upon thousands of potential technology solutions that could be advantageous within the health sector that should be looked at. But there's at least now a process within Scotland to help to facilitate that.
I think there's quite a lot of people as well, just to chip in here, there's quite a lot of people, each NHS region has an innovation champion. There's a whole pile of people you can go and talk to. There are models like this triple helix model, like this iCared project we've been referring to, and Sandosh's living lab for precision medicine here in Glasgow as well. Again, these similar models where you're trying to get a set of people working together, speaking a common language and coming out of their mental model of being in a company or the mental model of being in a university or whatever, and think about how do we work together to solve this challenge, because this challenge is bigger than all of us. A smarter guy than me told me one time that precision medicine is a team sport, and I absolutely agree with it. Not even a company the size of Canon, we're a pretty big company, 200,000 people worldwide, we can't touch the surface of delivering precision medicine for real. It's going to take a whole group of small companies and big companies, big organizations, NHS boards, other organizations, university researchers to come up with some of the great ideas, some startups, some whole pile of different types of organizations and different people have to come together to really address these challenges. So I think there is an opportunity. I actually think the environment is here if we can work through the processes and solve the problem. I mean, we've referred to ANYA here in Scotland, but there's also the Accelerated Access Review in England, which again kind of determined the same ideas. And in fact, your whole organisation, Phil, is very much on a mission round about creating this space where these relationships can be brokered such that we can reduce these barriers. It's tough, though. And there's a really good question, because it's really closely related that I want you guys' opinion on as well. There's a couple of ways. It's a couple of folk have asked similar questions. It's round about the willingness of the clinicians to adopt AI, and is there pushback from clinicians? And is that one of the impediments? What's your feeling on that? Who wants to come in first? Sandosh, are you up for talking to that one first?
Yeah, so clinicians have a responsibility to patients, and that's not to do any harm. So, and it's in their contract. It's their GMC regulates them, which means that they can only use systems that have got evidence, robust clinical evidence of safety and efficacy. And that comes from clinical trials or really good data. So once you provide that evidence and it goes into guidelines, then the care pathway changes. So that's about an innovation that really makes, that requires the physician to change practice. But on the flip side, we all think that the biggest sort of, the revolutionary sort of ideas and the revolutionary product would be these massive AI algorithms that will help diagnose or change practice. But there are a lot of other ways by which AI can help physicians, and that's in virtual assistants. Physicians are extremely busy. If they have assistants to do a lot of work, for instance, scheduling, writing a response, writing a report of a lab result, and what I've heard recently is ChatGPT would be ideal for physicians, because you got hundreds of patients, hundreds of reports to feed back to the patient. Most of the time you don't feed back. You can have AI to help physicians write a draft report and then you correct it. So there are lots of ways by which physicians can use. It's anything which lowers the burden, the work burden on the physicians will accept. One is the efficacy and evidence. If it's there, then they will be forced to use it if you show efficacy and safety. Other products, it has to reduce the work burden. Physicians have, or any clinician, nurses, they always think if there's a new technology coming in, they have to learn something new and it's going to add to their workload. And that puts them off. As long as you convince them that this is actually going to reduce your workload, then. So it's integrating into their work stream, into their common sort of system of working, then that you'll get adoption easily.
So there are two parts to my answer to this question. So the first part focuses on clinicians or healthcare professionals more broadly. In my experience and the experience of our teams who are working on this every day of every week, there's a real range of perspectives. Some clinicians are naturally inclined to want to work in this way, and in fact are innovators themselves. I've got one sat to my immediate left. They're at one end of the spectrum, I would suggest, and then I won't go into the kind of other end of the spectrum. There's a range of perspectives, okay? You just need to understand that and accept it. And part of our role as an organisation is to understand which are the healthcare professionals in our region who are particularly inclined to work in this way and very open to collaboration. So again, you may need some help figuring out who they are, come and have a conversation. The other part of it, and Sandosh makes an important point here, so today's panel is framed as precision medicine, but more kind of increasingly over time, the conversations that I'm having with healthcare colleagues is around precision healthcare in a broader sense. And I was on a panel a few weeks ago when we were asked, what are the key themes, topics, emerging trends, and a colleague on the panel made the point that actually most healthcare professionals, if pushed, and what do you want to help with? Their answer will tend towards kind of low complexity, high volume, as opposed to the opposite, high complexity, low volume. There's space for both, but if I was going to encourage an innovator today to think about, how would I develop a system, there's a massive demand for low complexity, high volume. But I think most of the focus tends to shift to the other end, where you're talking about really complicated multimodal data. Lots of opportunity right across that range. So, really think about what could you do as innovators and against those different types of use cases. That would be my take on it.
So I think we've done some surveys of both healthcare professionals and of patients around the use of artificial intelligence algorithms in the care pathway. Speaking to radiologists across the UK in the survey that we did, they identified that they were supportive of the integration of artificial intelligence platforms, but where they were supporting their clinical decision making, not where they were taking over the clinical decision, because the clinicians have ultimate responsibility for the diagnosis and the treatment. So there were, and as has been said, there's a huge spectrum of some individuals just no way would I want to have that integrated in, and others very, very supportive. But I think you're right in thinking it's the low complexity jobs that we all have in any sector that take up the time. You know, I keep pushing for the university. We need more professional services staff, because if I have the professional services staff to do the jobs for me, it means that I have time to do that high complexity thinking and the time. So I think you're right there in thinking that often companies are looking for really complex solutions to complex problems, but sometimes it's the really basic things that might actually be beneficial.
Great. Thanks. Apologies, there are loads more questions and we're running out of time, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to draw this to a close now. We really could keep going for another 2 or 3 hours on this basis. And we really only just mentioned ChatGPT. We could spend an hour, we could spend loads of time on that. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists just very quickly for a takeaway. So at least all of you are going away with remembering one thing, or try and remember all 3, but just pick the one that you think. So just that's your challenge, all of you. Yeah, Phil, why don't you start?
So collaboration is absolutely fundamental. This is a team sport. I completely agree with whoever you quoted earlier. But that collaboration has to include patience. So that would be my take on when you're thinking about how you're approaching these programs in the future. Collaborating with clinicians and healthcare professionals is fantastic, but think about where's the patient voice in this. And that's not always an easy thing to think about, and often people tend to kind of leave it much later than it probably needs to be brought in. So collaboration.
Brilliant. Thanks.
So I would suggest the most important bit is to recognize that AI systems will provide augmented intelligence and augmented insights to help a human do the work, not to replace the human. So you always have to have human in the loop. And that's important, because if you're trying to build a totally independent AI system, then getting that into clinical implementation would be problematic.
Brilliant. Thanks, Santosh.
Well, I'm a data scientist, so mine has to be in relation to data, but I think what we need to be doing is facilitating appropriate access for researchers, for companies, and for the healthcare physicians to have access to that information, preferably on a single system, so that we can see everything or have access to everything. But until that is in place, ensuring that we are utilising the right types of data to be able to answer the clinical questions, and considering bias within that to ensure that the solutions that we identify don't further lead to more inequalities, and that we are supporting the care and health sector as we move forward.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Leslie. And I guess I'm going to chip in, because chairman's prerogative, and I actually, I kind of really, I'm actually probably with Phil's point as well. Again, someone else, a smarter person than me, told me, if you're wanting to do something difficult, try and find people who want to work with you. Build a coalition of the willing. That's what you need to try and do. If we're going to do something difficult, which is to take some embryonic science, some overhyped technology, put it together into something that's really difficult as an organisation like the NHS here in this country, you're going to have to work with other people. You're going to have to work and find people who are prepared to do something different, step out of their comfort zone. So I'd encourage all of you who are interested in being part of this journey to think about that, and remember, you've got to step out of your comfort zone to have an impact doing this. Finally, just thank you very much all for joining us. Thank you very much for your questions, and apologies I did such a bad job and didn't manage to get us through more of these, but I really hope you found it useful and interesting, and thank you very much.
You've done an amazing job, so thank you so much, Ken, and thank you to our panellists. Please join me in thanking those.
Thank you. Thank you.